It was the spring of 1943, and Sergeant Werner Junge had expected a cage. He had been told what Americans did to prisoners. Every soldier in the Wehrmacht had heard the stories. Brutality, starvation, humiliation. That was the contract of defeat. So when the truck slowed and the gates of his new home swung open somewhere in the American interior, he braced for the worst. What he found instead broke something in his understanding of the world. There was a canteen. There were recreational facilities. There was, reportedly, beer. He had surrendered. He had not expected comfort. That contradiction is the whole story. Before a single German soldier set foot on American soil as a prisoner, the Nazi regime had already filled his head with a particular picture of the enemy. American soldiers were soft. American society was decadent, racially mixed in ways the ideology deemed weak, commercially obsessed, incapable of the hard discipline that real war demanded. The propaganda was not subtle. It was systematic, and it had been running for years by the time the first large waves of German POWs began arriving in the United States, following the North African Campaign of 1942 and 1943. These men had been raised on a specific story. They believed it not because they were foolish, but because it was all they had been given. A soldier fights inside the world his government builds around him, and the world the Nazi government built said that America was a paper tiger, loud, rich, and ultimately unwilling to bleed for anything. Imagine what that soldier carried with him onto the transport ship crossing the Atlantic. Not just his wounds, not just his exhaustion, but that entire architecture of belief, still mostly intact. He was a prisoner, yes. He had been captured, yes. But in his mind, perhaps, this was a temporary embarrassment. Germany would turn the tide. The Americans did not have what it took. He still believed the story, for now. The Atlantic crossing itself was the first quiet disruption. German POWs transported to the United States were held aboard ships that, by any reasonable wartime standard, treated them with a degree of care they had not anticipated. They were fed. They were not beaten on the decks. The journey was long and disorienting, but it was not the nightmare the propaganda had sketched. Then came America itself. Men who had grown up in bombed cities, who had marched through the rubble of a continent at war, now pressed their faces toward whatever light they could find, and watched the American landscape roll past. The country was not rationed into ruin. The cities were not hollowed out. The factories they glimpsed from train windows were running. The roads were intact. The lights were on. This was the second disruption, and it was a deeper one, because it was not about how the Americans treated prisoners. It was about what America simply was. A nation untouched by the physical destruction of the war, producing at a scale that bore no resemblance to the weakened, spent giant the propaganda had described. There are accounts, and we should hold them carefully, because memory through captivity is fragile, of German soldiers growing quiet on those train journeys. Not sullen, exactly. Quiet in the way a person goes quiet when a calculation they trusted suddenly produces the wrong answer. But the real shock was still ahead, because nobody had prepared them for what the camps actually looked like. The prisoner of war camps that received German soldiers across the American interior operated under the Geneva Convention of 1929. The United States had signed it, and, this is the part that stunned men conditioned by Nazi ideology, the Americans actually followed it. The convention required that prisoners be housed, fed, and treated according to standards roughly equivalent to the host nation's own troops. What that meant in practice, in the wealthiest and most industrially productive nation on earth in the 1940s, was something no German soldier had been prepared to encounter. The camps had barracks, they had mess halls, they had recreational spaces. Prisoners could form orchestras, put on theatrical productions, play football in the yard, and attend educational classes. And then there was the canteen. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to purchase small goods with the scrip, the camp currency, they earned from labor. In practice, this meant that at numerous camps across the United States, German POWs could walk into a camp store and buy cigarettes, toiletries, candy, and in some documented cases, beer. Let that sit for a moment. A soldier of the Third Reich, captured and transported to the soil of the nation he had been taught to despise, was standing in a canteen buying beer. The ideological vertigo this produced was not minor. These were men whose government had told them that American civilization was a fraud, a thin commercial veneer over a weak and morally bankrupt society. And here was that society, even in war, even with its enemies inside the wire, following its own rules. Not performing humanity for a camera, following the rules because the rules were the rules. German POWs were put to work. This was also permitted, required in fact, under the Geneva Convention, provided the labor was not directly connected to the war effort. And so across the American South and Midwest and West, German soldiers found themselves harvesting cotton, processing food, working in lumber mills, doing agricultural labor that American workers had left behind when they went to war. They were paid for this work. 80 cents a day was the standard rate for enlisted men, a figure that followed the convention's requirements. Officers were paid more and were not required to work at all, another provision of the same agreement. 80 cents sounds small, but it was real money in scrip form, convertible at the canteen, and it was more than nothing, which is what many of these men had expected. Some POWs later described a strange, dissonant normalcy to the labor, rising in the morning, working the fields, returning in the evening, a rhythm that in its structure felt almost like ordinary life, except for the fence and the guards and the enormous ocean between them and home. Some camps held tens of thousands of men. By the war's end, the United States had processed well over 400,000 German prisoners on American soil. 400,000 men who had been told one thing about America and then lived inside a different America entirely. The question the open loop planted at the start of this story, why would captors give prisoners beer, is beginning to answer itself. But there is a harder layer underneath, and it involves what these men started to think, quietly, after weeks and months inside those camps. Hit subscribe right now, because what he admitted next changes everything. Do not go anywhere. It did not happen all at once. It rarely does, when a worldview begins to give way. But the accumulated evidence of daily life inside an American prisoner of war camp worked on these men the way water works on stone, slowly, without drama, and then one day you look, and something fundamental has shifted. The Nazi ideology had a specific and central claim about America, that its apparent strength was illusory, built on a false foundation, and that it would not hold under real pressure. German soldiers had been equipped with that claim the way they had been equipped with their rifles. It was standard issue. It was supposed to be protective. Inside the camps, that claim ran continuously against reality. The food did not run out. The guards, by most documented accounts, were not sadists. The country outside the fence was not starving or collapsing. The war news, prisoners received filtered access to news, and rumors traveled faster than any official channel, suggested that Germany was not turning the tide after all, that the tide, in fact, was moving the other way. And then there was the simple human fact of contact. German POWs worked alongside American civilians. They were supervised by American soldiers. In many cases, especially in rural areas, desperate for agricultural labor, that contact became something approaching ordinary. Farmers who needed their crops brought in were not thinking about ideology. They needed the work done. German prisoners who needed something to do were not, in that moment, thinking about ideology either. They were thinking about the work. Remember what he believed at the start? Here is where it breaks. Not in a single dramatic moment of conversion. Life rarely offers those. But in the slow, grinding accumulation of everything that simply did not match what he had been promised. The American military assigned officers to oversee these camps, and their reports, filtered through military bureaucracy and the particular limitations of official record-keeping, tell a cautious but consistent story. The German prisoners were not, as a group, immediately broken of their National Socialist beliefs. Many remained ideologically committed for months. Some, particularly the hardened SS prisoners who were segregated at camps like the one at Alva, Oklahoma, remained resistant throughout their captivity. But the general population shifted, slowly, visibly enough that American intelligence officers noticed it and, in some cases, deliberately cultivated it. There were programs, the Army's own re-education initiatives, designed to expose German prisoners to American democratic values, American newspapers, American films. The goal was to send men back to Germany after the war, with some seed of something different planted inside them. Whether those programs worked as designed is a question historians still debate with care. What is less debatable is that the environment itself, independent of any formal program, was doing something to the men inside it. Some POWs later wrote or spoke about the specific moment when the ideological scaffolding began to come apart. Not the ideology of German nationalism necessarily, but the specific lie about America, the claim that it was weak, decadent, incapable. That particular lie was hard to maintain when you were eating 3 meals a day in the country you had been told could not sustain itself, when you were buying cigarettes in a canteen that should not have existed, when the guards were following rules that your own government had told you Americans would never bother to follow. One line keeps surfacing in the accounts of German veterans who survived captivity in America, in various forms and phrasings. We had no idea. Not about the war, not about who would win, about what the country actually was. The population of German POWs in American camps was not monolithic, and it would be a distortion to suggest that captivity in America produced a uniform awakening. It did not. Some prisoners, as noted, were deeply committed National Socialists who viewed any accommodation with their captors as treason. These men policed their fellow prisoners. In some camps, POWs who cooperated too visibly with American authorities, or who showed too much comfort inside the camp environment, faced intimidation and occasionally violence from the hardliners among them. There were kangaroo courts inside some camp populations. There were killings, German prisoners killing other German prisoners whom they judged to be collaborators or cowards. This, too, is part of the story, and it should not be softened. The ideology these men carried was not a costume they could simply remove. For some of them, it went all the way down to the bone, and no amount of fair treatment was going to dislodge it during the war years. But the men in the middle, the majority who were soldiers rather than true believers, who had fought because they were conscripted and trained and sent, who held the ideology the way most people hold the ideas of their society, loosely and without examining them too closely. Those men were quietly changed by what they encountered. The America they lived inside for months or years bore no resemblance to the America they had been issued as standard equipment before they shipped out. And that gap between the story and the reality was something they carried home with them when the war ended. The repatriation of German POWs from the United States began in earnest after Germany's surrender in May 1945 and continued through 1946. More than 400,000 men made the crossing back across the Atlantic, in the opposite direction from the one that had brought them, and into a Germany that was now rubble, divided, occupied, and trying to understand what it had done and what had been done to it. These returning prisoners brought something with them that is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. They had seen America from the inside, not as tourists, not as soldiers trying to kill it, but as captives living inside its daily rhythms for months on end. They had eaten its food, worked its land, bought small things in its canteens, and watched the gap between the propaganda and the reality widen until the propaganda could no longer be taken seriously. Some of them talked about what they had seen. In the devastated, humiliated, searching atmosphere of post-war Germany, a man who had spent 2 years in Kansas or Texas or Virginia had a different kind of authority than a man who had only heard stories. What he said about America carried the weight of lived experience, and what he said was frequently at odds with everything that had been official truth for 12 years. This is not a story about conversion or redemption. It would be too neat and too dishonest to frame it that way. These were complicated men returning to a complicated catastrophe, and their experiences in American camps were only one thread in the enormous, tangled fabric of what post-war Germany had to work through. But the thread was real, and it was woven in by beer in a canteen, by 80 cents a day, by guards who followed the rules, by a country that turned out to be nothing like the picture that had been painted of it. Which brings us back to the question this story opened with, the one that has been sitting underneath everything else, waiting. Why would a nation at war treat its enemies this way? Why the canteen? Why the beer? Why the pay? The recreational facilities, the theatrical productions, the orchestras. The cynical answer is that it was strategic, that treating prisoners well encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, and that the intelligence value of cooperative prisoners was worth the cost. That answer is not wrong. American military planners were aware of these advantages. But the more honest answer, the one that German POWs themselves arrived at slowly and reluctantly, and often without ever fully articulating it, is that America was doing what it said it believed in. Not perfectly, not without failure and contradiction and hypocrisy elsewhere in its conduct of the war. But inside those camps, in that specific context, it was following its own stated rules about how human beings should be treated, even enemy human beings, even in wartime. That was the thing that could not be explained away with ideology. A weak nation, a decadent nation, a nation of the kind the propaganda described, does not follow rules it doesn't have to follow. It cuts corners. It punishes. It lets the mask slip. The mask never slipped. And that, more than any battle or any statistic, was what broke the story these men had been told. Sergeant Werner Young had expected a cage. What he found was something far more unsettling, a country that believed in itself enough to extend that belief even to the men who had come to destroy it. He had no framework for that. None of them did. And in the quiet of the camp, in the ordinary passing of days far from the war, that absence of a framework was the closest thing to a confession any of them ever made. That is the real answer to the question this story asked. Not strategy, not softness. A civilization proving what it claimed to be, one 80-cent workday and one canteen beer at a time, to the men who had been sent to prove it false. If this story reached something in you, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Every week we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it, and the view from that side of history changes everything. Hit the like button if you stayed until the end. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. We'll see you in the next one.